welcome to our noon edition of Arirang News. Here are the stories making the headlines at this hour. More than 80% of next year's extra 2,000 admission slots will be allocated to medical schools outside the capital. The government is pushing through its medical reform plan despite medical associations' persistent opposition. For the fifth time straight, the U.S. Federal Reserve froze its benchmark lending rate. It hinted, though, that it could lower the rate 3 times within this year. And the UN has been keeping a close eye on North Korea's cyber activities. It has found Pyongyang to have obtained half of its total foreign currency income through cyber theft, with the profits being used to develop more weapons of mass destruction. The government is not backing down with plans to expand the med school admissions quota by 2,000 from the next academic year. On Wednesday, officials said at least 8 out of 10 of these new seats will be open at schools outside the capital area to better tackle the medical personnel shortage problem in rural regions. The government is also holding an open discussion today to provide better working conditions for doctors. Shin Se-byuk starts us off.
Even with doctors strongly against the medical school quota expansion, the government has pushed it through with its plan. On Wednesday, Education Minister Lee Ju-ho announced more details about how the additional 2,000 places will be allocated. This came following an address by Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, who further stressed the need to increase the enrollment quota.
When considering various factors such as changing demographics, changes to society, and development in medicine, an additional 2,000 doctors is the minimum required to tackle the doctor shortage.
2,000 additional places are mainly being distributed to medical schools outside the capital area, with around 82%, that is 1,639. State-run universities were guaranteed to have 200 places, while smaller medical schools that had fewer than 50 places have been allocated at least 100 to make sure the healthcare infrastructure is strengthened in areas outside the capital region. The remaining 361 seats went to medical schools in Gyeonggi-do Province and Incheon in order to narrow the gap in numbers between Seoul and other areas within the capital region. Based on the announcement, each university will have their new quotas reflected in their admission announcements for the 2025 academic year, which will be released to students in around May. Following the government's announcement, medical school professors, trainee doctors, medical students, and medical associations convened on Wednesday night to strategize their response. The primary focus of the meeting was to discuss when professors from medical schools nationwide might submit their resignation letters. Professors from leading national universities have agreed to resign en masse. However, they have not yet settled on a specific date for taking that step. Professors from Seoul National University and Yonsei University have already marked March 25th as their resignation submission date, while professors at other universities, including Ulsan National University and Sungkyunkwan University, are still fine-tuning their plans. In the meantime, the government plans to host an open discussion on Thursday afternoon aimed at addressing concerns and improving the conditions of medical residents. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
The U.S. Federal Reserve kept its interest rates steady once again as inflation persists. With the decision, South Korea's economic and finance leaders are likely to remain more cautious about interest rate cuts. Our economics correspondent Lee Soo-jin reports.
U.S. Federal Reserve officials kept rates unchanged for the 5th consecutive time on Wednesday, following the second 2-day Federal Open Market Committee meeting this year. With this latest move, the benchmark interest rates in the U.S. continue to stand in the range of 5.25% to 5.5%. And the key interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. remains at 2 percentage points, as the Bank of Korea also froze its rates for the 9th consecutive meeting in February. The U.S. Fed's decision to once again freeze interest rates, along with South Korea's consumer prices once again entering 3% territory last month, is increasing the likelihood of the Bank of Korea also keeping rates steady at the current rate of 3.5% at next month's decision rate meeting. There has been much speculation about when the Fed will begin cutting interest rates, with observers forecasting that rate cuts will come in the second half of the year. Following this latest meeting, policymakers forecast that 3 rate cuts will come by the end of the year, consistent with earlier forecasts and supported by the Fed chairman's comments.
We believe that our policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle, and that if the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year.
A fresh set of quarterly U.S. economic estimates has also been released, showing an elevated projection for inflation due to slower than expected progress towards the Fed's 2% target. The forecast says the personal consumption expenditures price index, excluding food and energy, will rise at a rate of 2.6% by the end of the year, compared to the 2.4% projection issued in December. And during Thursday's emergency macroeconomic meeting in South Korea, attended by the country's key economic leaders to discuss the potential impact of the U.S. Fed's rate freeze, Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok said that there is growing uncertainty about the timing of rate cuts in other countries, especially with the Bank of Japan's decision earlier this week to raise interest rates for the first time in 17 years. 이수진, Arirang News.
Exports of South Korean instant noodles, Ramyeon, hit yet another record high last month. Data from the Korea Customs Service released on Thursday showed that the total value of Ramyeon exports in February came to $93 million, a 31.5% rise compared to the same month the year before. This is the highest sum recorded for any given month, surpassing the previous record set in November last year. With this latest data, Ramyeon exports are well on track to surpass $1 billion by the end of this year, which will be the first time ever to achieve this feat. UN experts say North Korea has obtained half of its total foreign currency income through cyber theft. It also believes that 40% of the stolen income is used for developing weapons of mass destruction. Lee Seung-jae has more.
The UN Security Council Sanctions Committee on North Korea on Wednesday released its biannual report, which included details of military and political tensions on the Korean Peninsula over the 6 months from July 2023 to January 2024. The report said that not only have tensions on the Korean Peninsula heightened, but that according to a panel of experts, North Korea obtained half of its total foreign currency income through financial theft via hacking and cyber attacks. They added that such funds were obtained to cover 40% of the resources needed for developing weapons of mass destruction. The report says while there hasn't been a 7th nuclear test, the regime has been developing additional nuclear weapons and producing fissile materials to avoid UNSC sanctions. The panel pointed out that the continuous cyber attacks targeting the virtual asset industry is also a means of generating revenue by avoiding UNSC sanctions. As the crippling sanctions made it nearly impossible to obtain foreign currency needed to develop nuclear weapons and other missile technologies, hacking is used as the main means of earning such income. The report stated that it's currently investigating 17 cases of virtual currency theft last year in which North Korea was suspected to have been involved. The total amount stolen through such means amounts to $750 million. When looking at the amount stolen by North Korean hacking organizations between 2017 and 2023, the figure is a staggering $3 billion. The report also said the possibility of a technology transfer between Pyongyang and Moscow, which further fuels the regime's continued nuclear weapons development, is currently being investigated. The Sanctions Committee inspects the implementation of the international community's UNSC sanction against North Korea and reports the results of its activities to the UN twice a year. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
U.S. Forces Korea Commander General Paula stressed the need for Washington to continue to invest in the 28,500 American troops in South Korea in order to defend South Korea against North Korea's evolving threats. The comments came on Wednesday amid concerns that a return to the Oval Office by President Donald Trump could mean a reduction in the number of USFK troops, despite the current level being stipulated in the U.S. National Defense Authorization Act. Fueling the concerns, Christopher Miller, who served as the acting Pentagon chief under the former Trump administration, said in a recent interview that the time has come to talk about whether USFK still needs its current troop strength. However, LaCamera emphasized the need to compete in the gray zone with North Korea and continue support through various training programs to defend Seoul against the North's continued threats. With South Korea being a rapidly aging nation, President Yoon Suk-yeol emphasized the government's role in taking care of senior citizens through public housing and medical support. This comment came as on Thursday, President Yoon hosted a policy discussion with citizens on that topic in Wonju City of Gangwon-do Province. Specifically, Yoon said he would pledge to supply 3,000 public homes annually for financially hard-up elderly people. Silver Stay, a senior living project which includes comprehensive services, was also announced. As for medical support, Yoon pledged to expand at-home medical care, raising the number of long-term home visit centers to 250 nationwide. In addition, he said more local senior centers will offer healthy meals and even provide delivery services. South Korea has wrapped up the third Summit for Democracy, which invited world leaders, ministers, and members of civil society to discuss how to protect and advance freedom and human rights, especially in the face of growing digital threats posed by new technologies. Oh Soo-young covered the last day of the summit, so take a look.
President Yoon Suk-yeol has called on the free world to create joint high-tech countermeasures against fake news and the misuse of digital technology to prevent these from threatening democracy. During the third Summit for Democracy hosted by South Korea, Yoon opened a virtual plenary session of 36 world leaders on Wednesday local time, co-chairing the session with Denmark and Kenya. As more than 60 countries representing half of the world's 8 billion people hold elections this year, Yoon focused on artificial intelligence, elections and fake news, underscoring the need to protect electoral integrity as the foundation of democracy.
특정 세력들이 조직적으로 제작하고 배포하는 가짜 뉴스는 단순히 잘못된 정보를 전파하는 것을 넘어 사회적 갈등과 분열을 야기합니다. 또한 가짜 뉴스는 국민들이 사실과 다른 정보를 바탕으로 잘못된 판단을 내리도록 선동함으로써 민주주의 근간인 선거를 위협하고 있습니다. 이는 민주주의에 대한 분명한 도발입니다.
As societies become more and more exposed and susceptible to AI-generated content on online platforms heavily curated with algorithms, the South Korean leader said democratic countries should jointly develop AI and a digital mechanism to detect and eradicate forces that utilize the same technologies to generate fake news. This requires solidarity and the sharing of technology, he said, adding that the international community must also stand together to enforce measures against foreign intervention in elections. Statements by the leaders of Japan and the European Union backed his view, with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida saying that the use of deepfakes and audio created by AI undermines people's rights to make their own political choices, making societies become unstable and divided. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres added that the world must build guardrails for artificial intelligence and the digital world in order to protect democracy against technology's perils while realizing its promise.
The summit's theme, Democracy for Future Generations, reminds us of an additional essential responsibility. We must strengthen democratic systems and institutions for and with the world's 1.8 billion young people and for the generations to follow.
The plenary session also touched upon ways to build social inclusion and capacity for democratic governance, with the leaders of India and Canada calling for greater international cooperation.
민주주의는 세계의 안보와 번영의 기틀을 마련하기 위한 필수 조건입니다.
Closing the third Summit for Democracy, Yoon said the chair's statement will be published, summarising major points raised by the leaders to set out the future path for a renewal of democracy. According to his office, this includes the impact of new technologies on democracy, the role of government and the private sector, along with measures to counter fake news and false information. Emphasizing that advancing democracy takes collective effort beyond those made by a single country, President Yoon said that Seoul will collaborate with other governments, international organizations, and private actors as well to strengthen and expand democratic solidarity based on shared universal values. 오수영, Arirang News.
With Korea's 22nd general election just 20 days away, candidate registration has kicked off today morning, essentially marking the start of the election race. Our National Assembly correspondent Shin Ha-young has the details.
Candidate registration for South Korea's general election has begun. It will run for 2 days starting today from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Personal details including asset declarations, military service status, and criminal records of registered candidates will be publicly available through the National Election Commission's website. Both the ruling and main opposition parties last week each announced their 10 key pledges for the next 4 years with a shared emphasis on tackling the country's low birth rate. The People Power Party outlined its key pledges, focusing on 3 primary agendas: addressing the low birth rate, narrowing the widening wealth gap, and addressing climate change. The Democratic Party's commitments are centered around 4 major objectives: enhancing people's livelihoods, providing hope for the future, protecting democracy, and fostering peace. The party's focus lies in extending financial assistance to newlywed couples, such as providing public rental housing to couples with more than 1 child. Cities with major chipmakers plants including SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics in Gyeonggi-do Province, known as the Semiconductor Belt, are emerging as pivotal swing regions. Parties have been announcing chip-related pledges and nominating influential candidates in these areas. The ruling party pledged full support for the government's plan to create a mega chip cluster in Gyeonggi-do Province by 2047 and simplify the process for chip development and investment permits.
The Semiconductor Belt is essentially a creation of the People Power Party. We are the ruling party, and President Yoon has made a lot of diplomatic efforts regarding semiconductor issues.
Meanwhile, the main opposition party has committed to creating an ecosystem for a semiconductor powerhouse through regulatory reforms and tax incentives. These include extending the tax deduction deadline for investments in national strategic technologies and establishing so-called semiconductor megacities in the southern and eastern regions of Gyeonggi-do Province.
The semiconductor industry is the key engine for South Korea's economy. With the increasing significance of chips, competition is escalating, transforming into a national-level competition.
After the 2-day registration period, candidates can run their official election campaign from next Thursday until April 9, the day before the general election. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
An appeals court in Montenegro has had its final say on the case of the disgraced co-founder of cryptocurrency company Terraform Labs, Do Kwon, confirming that he will be extradited to his home country, South Korea. The extradition process will begin once he completes a prison term handed down in Montenegro. Yoon reports.
The Montenegrin Court of Appeals finalized on Wednesday the extradition of Do Kwon to his home country, South Korea. In a statement on its website, the court said that it had rejected an appeal by Kwon's legal representatives and upheld a decision by the country's high court on March 6th to hand over Kwon to South Korea rather than to the United States. The Court of Appeals assessed that the first instance court correctly determined that the request for Kwon to be extradited to South Korea arrived before the U.S. one. This verdict means the case is now closed regarding the country that Kwon will be extradited to. The Montenegrin Ministry of Justice will now set the exact date for his extradition. According to Bloomberg, that could take place as early as this weekend when his prison sentence in Montenegro for using forged documents comes to an end. Kwon was captured at an airport in Montenegro in March of 2023 as he attempted to board a private flight to the United Arab Emirates on a forged passport. After remaining in custody from the time of his arrest, he was sentenced to 4 months in prison in June of last year. An appeal against that ruling was rejected by a higher court, and the sentence began in November. Kwon faces prosecution for several criminal charges in South Korea and the U.S. South Korean prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for Kwon over allegations related to the crash of Terra USD and Luna coins in May 2022, which it's estimated wiped out nearly $37 billion in market value. Kwon is also wanted in the U.S., where he was charged with fraud by federal prosecutors in New York. Interpol also issued a red notice for Kwon, which is used for the highest level of wanted suspects and criminals. 이은진, Arirang News.
The Los Angeles Dodgers beat the San Diego Padres by 5-2 in Seoul on Wednesday in the Major League Baseball regular season game opener. Japanese superstar player Shohei Ohtani made his debut and helped the Dodgers to a comeback win over the Padres. The match was South Korea's first time ever to host an MLB regular season game, with nearly 16,000 people in attendance. The Dodgers and Padres will play their second match in Seoul on Thursday evening.
Let's take a look at the latest news in the world now. On Wednesday, Ireland's Taoiseach Leo Varadkar announced his resignation as Prime Minister and leader of the ruling Fine Gael party. He quoted personal and political reasons for his surprise move. Speaking at a press conference in Dublin, 45-year-old Varadkar said that he no longer feels fit for leadership and that the time is now to pass on the baton. He added that his time as the country's leader was the most fulfilling of his life. While Varadkar's resignation as head of the three-party coalition government does not trigger a general election, he said he asked for a successor to be elected before Fine Gael's annual conference on April 6th. The elected party leader will then be subject to a vote in Parliament before he or she is appointed as the Prime Minister. Leo Varadkar was Ireland's youngest Prime Minister when he became Fine Gael party leader at 38 in 2017. He is also the first openly gay Irish leader. The European Commission proposed on Wednesday a plan to transfer profits generated from frozen Russian assets in Europe to Ukraine. This would mean that most of some $3 billion of annual profit from the frozen Russian central bank assets would be spent on the Ukrainian military. Currently, there are about $230 billion of frozen Russian central bank assets held in various currencies across the European Union. The exact amount of profit each year depends on global interest rates. Under the EU plan, 90% of the funds taken from Russia would be used to buy weapons for Ukraine, while rest would be used for recovery and reconstruction. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell met with Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, after which he urged member states to approve the plan quickly. Shmyhal said that Ukraine expected the EU and G7 countries to confiscate the original Russian capital itself. Moscow said on the same day that the measure is banditry and theft that would destroy Europe's reliable reputation of safeguarding financial and property rights. According to the latest World Happiness Report released on Wednesday, Finland remains the happiest country in the world for the 7th year in a row. The World Happiness Report, produced as part of the United Nations Global Initiative, measures the absence of corruption, freedom, generosity, health, income and social support to determine a country's national happiness. Nordic nations Denmark, Iceland and Sweden were just below the top spot. Afghanistan and Lebanon were at the bottom of the list. Kim Seong, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. We had a colder start than Wednesday, but with less wind, it made it more bearable. Afternoon highs should go up higher than Wednesday, but still hovering below the seasonal norms. It was a colder morning for mountainous regions, so there is a big gap in ratings in most places. Do dress accordingly. It's always better to feel a little warmer. Meanwhile, nearly 25 centimeters of snow fell in mountainous regions in Gangwon-do yesterday, which helped to ease the dryness in the air. But the rest of the east is still under a dry weather advisory, while the east of Seoul is under a dry advisory for the first time this season. Then highs in Seoul will be topping out at 11 degrees. Daejeon, Jeju make it to 12 degrees Celsius this afternoon. It should not be as windy as yesterday under sunny skies nationwide throughout the day today. Then more rain is in the forecast across Korea for the next 5 days, but it will get much warmer towards Sunday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That's all we have for you at this hour. We'll bring you more updates from Korea and around the world at the same time tomorrow.